just maybe if you could just focus first on the First Timothy 2 text, explain what you see there. And I'll just preface this by saying anytime in a public setting, that I'm talking about women in ministry, inevitably, I've never yet had an instance, and I don't know if you can attest this as well, where somebody didn't throw out First Timothy 2:12 as if it was like a mic drop moment, as if I'd never thought of that verse before, right? It's just like, that's the verse that's the game changer. So I thought it makes sense to kind of focus on that. And you take a little bit of a different line, right? Whereas many in the egalitarian camp have tried to discern some sort of problem or issue underlying the rhetoric there, your line is to say more generally, no, I think actually this makes good sense in its historical context. So I'd love to just give you a chance to unpack that a little bit for us, for the audience, because I think that's a really important part of the book.
Thanks. Yeah, in general, I'm not a big fan of trying to discern the history behind the New Testament text, because I think it's always very speculative. And although it's been useful for people like those trying to pursue the egalitarian line, so I acknowledge that. But in this case, I think that the language actually can make sense, and we can hold it alongside the language in chapter 3, which clearly identifies women as leaders, and try to understand how both of those things come out of the same writer. Right? So First Timothy is a great example of how we still have these two piles of evidence that we were talking about earlier, right, but they actually exist within the same author. So we can't really separate them and say, there's a group over here that does this, and there's a group over here that does that. That is what people try to do with the 1 Corinthians 14 piece, right? Saying it wasn't actually Paul that wrote it. But in First Timothy, you really can't do that. They're both there. They're stuck in the same piece of writing. And so what does that mean? Like, why did ancient people, how would that make sense to them? And the way that I've come to understand it is to think of the language in chapter 2 as an affirmation of a very widely held cultural ideal, which was that women should be silent in front of men. Now, what people meant by that, I think, is they actually meant it for men too. Any person, it was good to cultivate the ability to control your speech when you were in the presence of somebody who was your social superior, right? Again, back to the hierarchy, right? So if an elder is in the room with you, right, or a neighbor who is of higher social class, you should completely defer to them in speech, whether they're male or female. And it's all about discerning your own social position in relation to the people around you. I think ancient people were really good at that because they had to do it every day in different situations. And so for them, this would have been not a problem at all. But that doesn't mean they do still make these grand statements like women should be silent in front of men, right? Or husbands should speak for the family. Those kinds of statements occur all the time, even though we also find lots of evidence that women are speaking, and they're praised for doing it, and they're doing it in important situations, right? So Mary Magdalene is a great example. She goes and says, I have seen the Lord, right? Nobody says, oh, shush, don't do that, right? Because it's valuable, it's important, and she's the only one who can bear that message. And so that would totally make sense in the ancient world. And the same in First Timothy, we have that affirmation of hierarchy and status, and of that very, very important virtue of self-control, right? The ability to control your speech.
Sophrosune,
self-control, which is built into that passage, right? Because the portion before it about clothing is really about controlling your display of your wealth, right? Not gold and pearls and braided hair, these fancy hairstyles that women had at the time, but to show simplicity in dress, which was understood as self-control, which was, by the way, an important qualification for leadership in the ancient world. It's the same thing that shows up in the qualifications for all of it, the bishops and deacons in chapter 3. Don't drink too much, don't talk too much, or don't say what you don't mean, right? All of these kinds of qualities fit together under this rubric of self-control, which was a widely held virtue in antiquity, and one that Christians really emphasized in the New Testament letters, especially. So I see those as fitting together, actually. If we see chapter 2 not as prohibiting all women's speech or authority, but as saying, women, like men, women should cultivate self-control with regard to their tongue and be, acknowledge the hierarchy around them. But I see that actually still left a lot of room for women to be leaders in the early church.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And it's something you've stretched me and caused me to really wrestle with that, because I've been one who's leaned towards some kind of underlying explanation maybe for what's going on there. But I mean, your argument has pushed me to think about maybe no, maybe we don't need to find some kind of issue going on here. It might just be a generalized statement. And, and even fitting in with what he says just above, using the same root word for silence, living, it's sometimes translated like living peaceably, but we can see here that he's concerned with general kind of presentation, cultural presentation to the wider world of the assembly. And I also just want to underscore your point about the clothing and the dress. This is sometimes misunderstood as having to do with like female sexuality or sensuality, but it's really about not showing off wealth. That's really the primary thing, which ancients harp on a lot, actually. If you want to be a good ruler, a good leader, you're one that is self-controlled, restrained. You don't show off your wealth or your position.
I also the last thing you want is a ruler who spends all their money on a dinner party and doesn't have any left to build a road through town, right? And this was a real thing in the ancient world, because that was how most of the roads and fancy buildings were built, was because of the patrons who donated it.
Yeah. And I mean, it's not like we have any, issues with our politics today and politicians making a bunch of money, or,
I know. I wish we would cultivate this virtue a little bit more today, to be honest.
Right. I had another point that was really interesting to kind of underscore what you were saying, is the two authors that you draw out making very similar statements to what we find here in 1 Timothy 2:12, Cato and Plutarch both have these kind of statements about women being quiet, deferring, asking their husbands at home, and yet these authors both still have other statements about women speaking and praising women for speaking. Plutarch's advice to bride and groom, I think, is one of the more illuminating texts to read alongside some of Paul's letters, because this is written to one of Plutarch's female students. Plutarch was probably on the more egalitarian side of elite men who were writing, but still nowhere near where we would maybe want him to be. But he's got these statements about, women being quiet, women deferring, but then also praising women for speaking. He's quoting female philosophers. So yeah, really helping us wrestle with the tension that we sometimes have treated these things like they're mutually exclusive, one or the other. And what you show is actually we find them kind of side by side in the same sources.
Yeah, absolutely. And I can't even remember how I came upon this discovery, but I'd read Advice to the Bride and Groom, but then also later discovered that the person that's addressed to, Eurydice, is the woman. She's marrying somebody, and Plutarch writes to them, but she's the one who's really he has a connection to, and she's actually been his pupil, right? So Plutarch, this famous philosopher, has taught this wealthy young girl, but there are inscriptions to Eurydice by her daughter. She was also apparently a priestess at the shrine at Delphi. And so you see, again, that social standing, right? And you can sort of imagine what kinds of expectations would have come along with being a priestess at Delphi. And it just changes the way that I think contextualize what Plutarch says and the advice he's giving.
Yeah.
But it is general advice, right? It's not like there's a problem. It's not like Eurydice and Phineas have a bad marriage and he's trying to fix it. Again, thinking about 1 Timothy and like what the context is, it's that this is just really good advice to give people in marriage, is to acknowledge that, men have a higher position than women in the family, and it's going to create harmony and all of this kind of stuff. But then you still see Eurydice doing these great things.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Okay, one little one I want to sneak in here just to get your thoughts on. Do you have any take on the use of the term alphanteo in 1 Timothy, that it's often translated like exercise authority over, but people have made a big deal that, we don't have that many instances of the use of this word. And so when you look at it in context in other places, it has a kind of violent, domineering connotation, but others will come back and say, but it's put right alongside with didasko, teaching. So, and there's all these kind of debates raging back and forth, but I'm just curious, does it factor into your thinking at all? Or is this just, I kind of used a weird word to talk about some kind of authority. I think Plutarch when he's talking, he says it's shameful for the wife to. It's not the same word. It's like it's some kind of form of exercising authority over her husband. Maybe not quite like alphanteo, but it's there's some kind of word that he uses for that. But yeah, I'd just be curious to hear your thoughts on
Yeah.
it.
I think it makes less difference to me what that particular word means, because I'm not people who want to, say that authenteo has a very narrow meaning are trying to limit what that verse says, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's because they see it as a prohibition for all women at all times or everywhere.
Right.
And since I don't see it that way, I think the cultural context meant that people would have interpreted it differently, and the social status would have been so important in understanding it that it doesn't matter to me as much to try to
Sure.
limit what authenteo means. I do think, however, that part of what is problematic to the ancient people about women having authority, whatever that means, over a man, is that it does suggest, I mean, if the woman and the man are of the same social standing, it suggests a real faux pas socially, right?
Right.
And so in that sense, I think the idea that authenteo is kind of an abuse of authority or a misuse of authority would fit that. What that does suggest what they mean is that you're not playing by the hierarchy the way that we understand it should.
Yeah, yeah. No, that's good. And in that case, it would be right in line with what Plutarch says about it being shameful for the wife to exercise authority or mastery over her husband. Yeah, no, that's good. What would you see also like instructions in the pastoral epistles that presume that an elder or overseer would be the husband of one wife? Right, because we also hear that kind of language, that would be absolute, or is that again a general rule? But ancients would know, like, hey, no, if you've got a woman that's qualified or of higher status, then in this case, go for it. Would you put it in that same category, or do you see the pastorals as being maybe a little bit more restrictive than other places?
I think most of those virtues point us towards guidelines for like what is most important about these leaders, right? What are the virtues that we want them to cultivate? And the idea that someone was a husband of one wife or a wife of one husband, goes both ways. That suggested virtue. It was in part because it suggested fidelity to your spouse, and
Right.
ancient people valued that. It wasn't that you couldn't get remarried or that divorce wasn't even allowed. It was, but they still valued this idea of fidelity to your spouse. And it also suggests self-control, right? Sexual self-control, to not get remarried. And so those are virtues, but they weren't absolute. And I don't think, I mean, in early Christianity, eventually Christians get very much on the sexual fidelity and chastity bandwagon, and it does become not absolute, but it becomes very important over time. So I don't want to rule that out as a possibility, even when that letter was written. But in general, I think that idea of self-control is what is most important in the qualities that we see there.
Yeah, no, that makes sense.
Thanks so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please make sure you subscribe using the link below and check out some more of our videos.